In this chapter, we're going to see how we can use delay effects to actually enhance beat programming. Often when we're thinking about programming patterns and beats, we think about using MIDI notes to trigger the patterns that we want, placing notes in grids or in sequences in order to make patterns sort of one note at a time. But what we're going to do in this video is to see how delay effects can actually help create kind of polyrhythmic variations to beats around some pretty simple starts. Let's just play this track through that I've got open here, and we'll just begin just then to dive into a couple of individual moments which maybe would benefit from being enhanced with a delay effect. Okay, so the top track up here is a kick, and then what we've got is separate little individual percussive hits that are happening on the other three tracks. What I'm going to do is just solo those for a moment so we can hear them by themselves. So you can hear that this last part here has got this kind of reverberant hit, and these ones are much sharper and much drier. Now what I want to do is to just begin to think about how I could maybe enhance these three individual sort of slices, these tracks of sort of sliced up percussive elements, using delay to maybe create something which is a bit more interesting rhythmically. So I'm going to start with this part in the middle here, and what I'm going to do is to go to Waves H delay. We're just going to fire this up here and put this on this track. And what I'm going to start by doing is turning off the analog circuit, which is in the bottom right hand corner. There are a few little sort of different modeling circuits within H delay, and what I want to do is to make sure that I'm keeping that off, because I don't want the hiss that comes with the second analog circuit, which is the default choice here. What I'm then going to do is to select the ping pong delay, so that any delays that I add to this part are going to bounce from left to right. And what I'm interested to try and do is potentially to create something a little bit sort of dotted and sort of skipped in this rhythm. So I'm selecting an 8th dotted delay, which is the default choice. If I want to change it, I can simply move this up and down and select different delay values, but the dotted 8th delay is the one that I want. And what I'm then going to do is to set a dry wet balance. Because I've added this effect as an insert, I'm effectively sharing the dry original signal with the wet process signal. So I'm going to set a dry wet balance so I get a fair amount of both signals. And then what I'm going to do is to turn up the feedback, so it's going to produce a number of different repeats. And to start with, those are the only settings that I want to experiment with. So I'm going to keep in the part above and the part below as well. But what we should find now is that this isolated hit now suddenly produces this dotted 8th note delay. And that's doing two things at once. Firstly, what it's doing is to produce a much more interesting rhythm. But what it's also doing is massively increasing the sort of stereo footprint of the track overall. Because these ping pong delays are bouncing from one side to another, each of their echoes is either on the left or it's on the right. And suddenly we get this much more interesting rhythm, but we also get a much wider mix overall. What I'm going to do next is to come to the part above. Let's close down H delay. And to this part, what I'm going to do is to add Valhalla's delay. And here what I'm going to do is to select a dual delay. So this time we have got separate delays on the left and right hand sides, but they're not going to be bouncing left and right as the ping pong delay is on that second track. Now, when I select the dual delay, what I can then do is to choose a mode, which allows me to choose a sort of style of delay. And what I'm going to do is to come into here and choose the hi-fi option, which is a tape style delay, but a slightly brighter one than a traditional tape delay. Again, I've got a mixed balance here, which we're going to leave at 50%, balancing the original dry signal with the wet processed one. And then what I'm going to do is again, make sure that my feedback is set to a level to produce a number of different delay taps. Now, what I've got a chance to do here is now to then choose the type or speed of delay that I want to use. So in other words, do I want these to be clocked to a specific note, or do I want to work in milliseconds? Now, what I'm going to do is just solo this part for a second by itself, just so we're just hearing it all by itself. And you can see that by default, what Valhalla delay wants to do is to produce two separate delays, both of which are 300 milliseconds long. Now, let's just hear that, and then we'll discuss how I might go about choosing something in milliseconds that's maybe a different speed. Let's just hear how this sounds for now. Okay, so we've got this very odd effect, which is that clearly the delays within this, or at this particular speed, aren't clocking to the tempo of my track. I'm going to turn the mix down a little bit so we can hear more of the dry signal and less of the delay, and I'll turn the feedback down a little bit as well. And this time I'm going to put the click track on, and we'll hear that these delays sound very smeary and not in time. Okay, so it's an interesting effect, but what if I want to work with something which is clocked to tempo, or I want to know how many milliseconds I need in order for my delay to be in time? Now, of course, remember, with Valhalla delay, I can select a note value here, but it's actually really interesting to work in milliseconds as well. And if you're working with maybe hardware delays and you don't have the opportunity to sync those to tempo because those delays are outside of the box, they're outside of your computer, knowing how to synchronize millisecond delays to the tempo of your track is a really useful thing to do. Now, to do this, there's a really useful little equation that we can do, and for that we're going to need a calculator. So I'm just going to go and find the calculator on my computer, and I'm going to open it up. And the magic number that we need is 240,000. Start with 240,000. And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide that by the tempo of our track. Well, the tempo of this particular project is 125 beats per minute. And then what I can do is to divide that by the quantize value that I want to use for my delay. So if I want an eighth note delay, I'm going to divide that by 8. And that's going to be 240 milliseconds. So what I'm going to do here is to select 240 milliseconds as the time of my left delay. I'm just going to just turn this dial down. And what I'm going to do here is to select a different value. I'm going to select 120, which is obviously half of that. So what we've got is a different delay speed, but nevertheless one which is a sort of fraction of the other one. And what we should now find is that those delays are in time. So if you're ever wanting to synchronize milliseconds to the tempo of your project, remember that equation, 240,000 divided by the tempo of your track, and then divided by whichever quantized value you want to use. So I've got a delay here which is working nicely. What I'm now going to do is just to slightly offset the mix. I want a bit less of the delay, but I'm going to slightly increase the feedback. And what I'm also going to do is to increase the amount of diffusion, which is just going to smear out these delays a little bit and make them a little bit more reverberant and a little bit less defined. Okay, let's turn off the click and put that back in with the other part that we added as well. Okay, so part of the reason why I've added this slightly more reverberant sort of delay effect to this part is because the third of these percussive sounds has got a little bit of reverb on it as well, just natively within the file. I haven't added that, that's just actually part of the sample that I'm using. And so what that part now should do is give me the kind of polyrhythmic delay thing that I wanted, but at the same time it's just kind of gluing the mix a little bit to this slightly more reverberant hit. And what I'm going to do with this last part is to put a much more sort of traditional style delay on it. So this is the more sort of reverberant hit. I'm going to use one of Logic's own effects for this. And what I'm going to do is to stick with the quarter note delay. I'm going to increase the feedback so I get a few more repeats from it. And again, let's just solo this sound so we can hear what this is doing. But what I'm going to do with these delays is I'm just going to slightly restrict the frequency content. So I'm taking out the bottom end of this sound so that the delays are not providing the sort of bassier frequencies or the lower frequencies within this sound, and we'll get a slightly thinner delay as a result. And what I'm also going to do is just to introduce a little bit of pitch flutter as well into these delays. So we just get a little bit of pitch variation here, both in terms of the rate of that and also the intensity of it as well. Okay, let's put that back in with the kick drum now. Okay, that's working nicely. Compared to where we started with just these really short little percussive sounds, we've got a much more interesting, fuller, wider mix now, just using different types of delay. Now what I'm also going to do is to unmute this little synth part, which is just on this final track here, and we'll just solo this, and it's a pretty unspectacular sound for now. Okay, so what I want to do is to add some delay to this sound as well, but again, maybe giving us some of that slightly more rich, big, wide cinematic experience that maybe we've added to those other parts now as well. So what I'm going to do this time is to add a delay here as well, but this time, rather than doing that as an insert, I'm going to add this effect as an auxiliary. Now, the advantage of working this way means that any delay that I set up on this sound is then going to be available to other sounds as well. Remember, auxiliary signals can be shared by any sounds within your track. So if I add a delay on an auxiliary or any effect on an auxiliary, it's going to be available to the other sounds within the mix too. So having set the sound up so that it's sending to this auxiliary, what I'm going to do is to come in here and choose another Valhalla plugin, but this time I'm choosing Supermassive. Now what this allows me to do, again, is to choose a delay time, and I can again do that either in milliseconds, and we know how to calculate one now that's going to be in tempo with the track, or as I'm actually going to do, I'm going to choose a dotted note, and I'm going to choose to start with maybe a dotted quarter note, and that's going to produce a delay for me. Again, what I'm doing this time is coming to my mix dial and turning this up to 100%. Because this sound is on an auxiliary, I only need the auxiliary to produce delay for me. The dry signal is coming from the channel and the effect is coming from the auxiliary. So that can now be at 100%. Remember, if you're working with auxiliaries, you only need those to produce all of the effect. You don't need the dry signal as well. So I'm turning that up to 100%. I want a nice big wide stereo effect here as well. Now then, what does Supermassive allow me to do? Well, it's a slightly different type of delay plugin, because what it does is it blends delays with reverbs. We've seen that with the kind of diffusion amount within the main Valhalla delay plugin. But what this does is to provide a series of different algorithms which allow me to sort of move from delays into longer echoes or reverbs. And so down here, what you'll find as you go from one of these to another is you'll see a description which allows you to see what the individual modes provide, and nice sort of descriptions of what each one does as you sort of select it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to the Sagittarius mode, which is here. Again, I'm going to choose feedback, which does what it does in the main delay. It allows me to control the volume of echoes. But what I'm going to do is to increase the density, which effectively, the higher this number, the more of the signal becomes reverberant. Again, we get delay taps here, and the more dense these taps become, the more like reverb they become. Again, I've got a modulation section, which allows me to introduce variation, both in terms of its speed and how much using this depth control. And again, I've got EQ here as well. But crucially, what we've got here is this warp control. And when warp is at 0, what we get is just the delay as set over here. But as we increase the warp amount, then effectively what happens is we start to smear out those delays. And rather than becoming separate individual echoes, they just begin to blend and change. So what I'm going to do is to press play, we'll hear that sound, and I'm going to increase the warp amount. So you can hear that when the warp amount is down here, let's just turn the feedback down a little bit so we don't hear that continuing for too long. What I have a chance to do is to hear these individual separate echoes, and the higher that warp value gets, the more it smears them into reverb. And so what we get a chance to do is to set this balance between maybe something which starts out as a delay and then progresses or evolves to become something else. So let's put it back into the track and see if we can find some settings which again take that synth from a delay into a reverb. I'm going to just add a little bit more brightness to this sound. So that's a really interesting effect. And we can hear this kind of really juddery, dotted effect that we're getting as a result. We get these individual delays, but we also get this kind of sense of space around the sound as well. So what we've done within this chapter is look at the ways in which we can increase the kind of polyrhythmic nature of sounds within our tracks using delays. And whether we want kind of really defined ping pong delays where we get ultra sharp definition, or whether we want something a little bit more like this, where we get this kind of slightly wonkier, more washed out, reverberant delay effect, what we can do is to make our mix richer and lusher and wider just using delays.